may have some questions such as, how did we decide who goes in what gallery? And that is not always easy to answer. We tried to think about what we knew of the artist's work already. So of course these artists all submitted bodies of their work, and then we were talking to them off and on about what they thought they'd be working on in the year, but we kind of decided early on who would get what room, so they would kind of know what space they had. Because they're also artists from the area, and some of them incredibly familiar with RAM and Wisdom, they kind of knew what these spaces were like anyway. The flip side of it is we asked for a portion of the work that's exhibited to be what was produced in the year. Where some of these artists, and I would actually point out specifically Belland and Divini, what you see, I would say 90% of what you see, if not more, was produced in the year. And a lot, as you can tell. And they both commented on the fact that they realized they produced a lot, that they were retired, and that they thought that that and the fellowship just gave them the freedom to just go for it. So we talked again off and on to the artists about what they would be producing, but it really wasn't until the end when they sort of gave us a checklist that we knew that Jerry Belland would have all of these little cartoons. Then he gave me really the freedom to kind of display them as I wanted. He brought all of the work in, and he had these little cartoons, panels, in the groups that are associated to the themes. Religion, politics, flying. You'll notice that he took a trip within the last year, and so there are a couple that comment on his experiences flying. But then to just kind of arrange them as I would want. So I kind of grouped it almost like graphic novels in a way, where you have a page and then you have another page with all these little images, and then you have a page which also has a lot of images on it in the bigger works. And they aren't together anymore by their theme or subject. And that was sort of purposeful with the thought that it would kind of keep people moving through. And for those of you who are familiar with this work, you notice that there's a lot of self-referential iconography. There's a woman who looks kind of like a pinup in thigh highs and a garter belt that shows up a lot, and you find out in that back corner panel, looks like, at least he would have us believe, that he had a teacher early on who maybe wore some, and you even see in the panel, in the ironing board panel that's to the right of it, it's kind of a similar figure. It's that schoolgirl teachery kind of mix. But then there's a great story that he kind of plays out in that longer piece where he's a little boy and he's thinking about what he'd have to do to save his teacher. So you have these really nice sort of self-referential moments that I think there's some nonfiction in there, and there's some fiction as well. And then of course he pops up a lot too. You'll notice with artists that deal with sometimes potentially difficult subject matter that they'll use themselves as a subject, so then that way it's not necessarily as confrontational. But at the same time, he doesn't really shy from confrontation. This is the donut series in the right corner, these 9 panels. And you'll notice that there's very little in a way that he wouldn't comment on, sort of satirically. There's Governor Walker, there's Democrats and how Democratic politicians and how they're responding to the world, there's Republican politicians, there's religion, and again, that follows through in every piece of his. And I really do encourage you to spend a little bit of time in here with them, because I would almost guarantee you'll laugh outright at least one thing.
Blubber butts.
Yeah. And the quality that he has here, he's really kind of played a lot off of that cartoon quality that you could see in some of his other work with these panels, where each one kind of reads like, it makes me think of The Far Side every now and then, if you guys remember that older, serial, because it has that super clever kind of biting humor. And then also, like I mentioned, he'll deal with art history directly. He's got this great one over here that is, this is a really good abstract painting, reasonably priced too, and he's kind of playing on what abstract painting is, or how we respond to the art world, in both sort of personally and commercially, and then above that there's Marilyn Monroe, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He also deals with some gender issues. He's got some that talk about women's roles, racial issues. Again, there's very little that he won't tackle. And does anybody here, I'm kind of curious, the people here who know him, he did one of these a day, in essence, one of these small little, he was using these as kind of journal pages. And it responds certainly to the way that some of his older pieces look and work. He was kind of playing back and forth off of that sort of snippet of an idea in like one day. I thought that was sort of an interesting way to move off of some of his, like you can tell that the ironing board pieces, that's a sort of slightly earlier version of his work. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. Does anybody have any comments or questions? And as a final, with all of these artists, Ram's role in the fellowship was more to sort of check in on everybody. How are you guys doing? Do you need anything? Do you have any questions or concerns, et cetera, et cetera? And that happened a couple times in the year. I didn't pick which work would show up in these galleries. We sort of left that up to the artists based on what they did in the fellowship year. I have gone and visited each of the artists and did interviews, which I'm putting on my blog, 2 of which have already shown up, 2 of which are still to come. So it is a little bit different than how we often operate, where we pick the work that goes in the exhibition. This was sort of a little bit more artist curated, but I think it's nice in a way because it lets them kind of show off what they were up to and what they think is important in the year. And then we did help sort of edit and place as the work came into the space. But at any rate, did you have a question?
Well, I was just going to say there's a lot of repetition in his work. He uses a lot of the same faces and a lot of the same animals in different pictures.
Yeah, and it's sort of like he's built up his personal vocabulary. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So did he do the larger pieces during the fellowship time, or?
Yes.
He did, okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, this one says 2012.
Yeah, and remember they got their fellowship in 2012, actually. They started, the awards were announced in March of 2012, and then basically it's really technically more than a fellowship year because then they had up until this exhibition opened to work on everything. And as a reminder, it's $2,500, and the idea is that it would offset something that's going on in the artist's life so that they could spend a little bit more time in the studio. We do not have specific parameters about how the money has to be used. If you wanted to use it to buy a new piece of machinery, great. If you wanted to use it because you need a little bit more extra time and you need your children in daycare for a week stretch or whatever, fine. It does not really matter. The idea is that it will just somehow sort of encourage your creativity.
Is the work for sale?
It is, yes. And actually, if you go to the front desk, there's a list that states what prices are and what's still available.
These cartoons are very reasonably priced.
They are.
They'll be fun to collect.
Does he talk about why he likes ironing boards?
He hasn't talked to me about that specifically. I think personally, I think could be a couple reasons. One of them is because it's a very iconographic shape, and it has kind of an old panel painting quality. Like if you even think about old altar pieces that would have the panels on the side, and they're often that very vertical sort of shape. And I also think that, of course, this imagery, not as much, but those of you who are more familiar with them, you know that the whole pinup and the nostalgia ideas and images show up a lot, and an ironing board is very, I think, nostalgic in that sense. And I don't mean nostalgic in a bad way. I mean it just has kind of a certain quality to it. Yeah.
It's probably very common in his household when he was growing up and as a boy, and a lot of the images harken back to being a kid.
Absolutely, and that was also kind of why I mentioned the teacher early on, because if you don't, and I mean, he's pretty available as an artist in a lot of respects, but he's also very, I think, unassuming about a lot of what he does. So, like you'll notice there's a sort of Ginger Rogers, Dale Evans, or some kind of like cowboy couple at the top of that one panel in the middle. I think there are images and things that he saw a lot when he was younger, and those certainly do show up.
And it's called The Good Little Boy, and he's like in the kettle with the devil.
Yes, there are a couple.
That's probably him as a kid.
There are a couple of other things like that that crop up in these small cartoons. And one other thing that I would mention is that he talks in his statement a lot about how I think this has been a very sort of critical life passage time for him. He talks a lot about how he feels like there's a little boy that's on one shoulder and like an old man that's on another. So I think there's a lot of like, who am I, where have I been? And I think he's done that a lot, but he mentioned it a couple times, both in the interview and in this statement, where he's kind of at that moment of reflection.
Well, hasn't he retired as a teacher?
Yeah.
So that's part of it.
Yes, definitely. And so is Doug DeVay.
Those ironing boards that make you think of Gothic.
Yes, that's what I meant, like the panel painting and the Gothic altarpieces. And I do know there's someone, like, it's to the point where people in town will donate their ironing boards for him to use. So if you have an old one that you don't want and you want something neat to happen with it, Jerry Belland may want it. Unless he's just going to these panels, I don't know for sure. But okay, let's move on.